Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Looking Ahead for Your Consumer Products. I'm Katie Chandler, a partner in Taylor Wessing's disputes team in the UK and head of our UK product liability and product safety team.
I'm Philipp Behrendt. I head our German disputes and investigations practice group, and I focus on product liability and product safety work as Katie does.
We're going to be talking to you today about the proposed changes to the European product safety regime, and also have a look at what the UK is doing post Brexit and what the position is there. We're focusing in particular today on consumer products and the EU's newly proposed general product safety regulation, which is set to replace the current existing general product safety directive. And is going to impose stricter safety rules across the EU for a wide range of consumer goods, such as furniture, textiles, and bikes, and particularly those products that are not subject to specific sector product laws, such as those governing medical devices, food, and toys. Just to say that the timing of this is, we are quite early on this, but we think it's important that businesses are aware of what's going on and what's coming down the line and do start preparing. The text of the EU regulation has been agreed in principle and awaits formal adoption this spring and is likely to come into force by the autumn of 2024. It will also affect UK businesses, and those on the line who supply goods into the EU will be wondering how this impacts them. We'll come on to talk about that. But it will be highly relevant to the UK market as well. We'll also discuss in some detail what these proposed changes are, but in a nutshell, one of the key objectives of the new legislation is to ensure better enforcement of safety requirements for goods bought by consumers online. So there is a real focus on online marketplaces, and Philip will come on to talk about that in more detail. There is also a bringing the legislation up to date, to ensure that it covers and accounts for new technologies, interconnected devices, and AI. And this follows recent proposals to update the product liability regime more generally, and the Product Liability Directive, and also the European Commission are proposing an entirely new AI liability directive. And all of that is to make sure that the product liability regime is fit for purpose and can apply to those products that incorporate software and AI and semi-autonomous functionality. So there's an obvious overlap with what we're going to be talking about today and all of the other new proposals and pieces of legislation that are going through at EU level. It's a very, very busy time. There's the AI Act, there's the Digital Services Act. I'm sure a number of you on the line will be following that closely, and also the recently passed Collective Redress Directive to introduce a new class action regime in the EU. And all of this is designed to work as a package to put consumer protection at the forefront of the agenda, and all global businesses really placing products on the EU market will need to be aware of all of these developments and make sure that they are prepared and ready to be able to comply. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. We'll look at the current regime for product safety for consumer goods, and then we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into the new proposed regulation, and finally we'll come to sort of discussing how that is going to impact the UK. Philip will obviously talk about the EU, and then we'll end with sort of some practical tips on what you should be doing and thinking about now and what you can do to get best prepared. We'll take questions at the end if that's okay with everybody. Do feel free to put them in the chat, but we would like to just get through all of the detail because there is quite a lot to cover, and then we'll cover questions at the end. We'll also follow up with the slides, and the session's being recorded as well.
Yeah, so let's take a little bit of a brief look into where we stand now. So currently, to consumer products, the General Product Safety Directive 2001/95/EC applies. It applies to that extent that there are not sector-specific rules, which there are, for example, for certain electrical products, medical devices, toys, etc. Even if there are sector-specific rules, the General Product Safety Directive still applies to the extent the sector-specific legislation remains silent on certain issues. There is a feeling that the General Product Safety Directive needs updating, which is probably fair, in particular in the context Katie explained, as we see a general move to modernize product laws, whether it's product safety, whether it's product liability, etc. One significant factor is, for example, that the General Product Safety Directive does not expressly deal with software as a product, so it's unclear to what extent that is included. In general, the rule was and will be under the Product Safety Directive that products that are placed on the market need to be safe products. And it's worthwhile looking at Article 2b of the General Product Safety Directive, which we have printed here, and what is being considered and taking into account when determining whether a product is safe or not, which are in particular the characteristics of the product, including composition, packaging, instructions, the effect on other products, presentation of the products, and the categories of consumers at risk. You see that the difficulty of determining safety of a product is never, and neither under the old nor the new rules, a black and white picture, because it's always a gray picture, because you always have products which have some inherent risk. And that is under product safety rules, not something which has to be avoided by all means, but risks have to be minimized as far as possible. The General Product Safety Directive, so the old regime, already required producers to inform consumers with sufficient, or provide consumers with sufficient information to allow consumers to make an independent decision and independent assessment of the risks a product may pose. It did already include distributors of products as one of those parties who are addressed by product safety rules. They had to act with due care to help ensure compliance, and they have in particular a duty to monitor safety of products that have been placed on the market, and in particular to assist in recall events as well. And in these events to cooperate with the relevant authorities also. A large exception as compared to what we will see in the new rules was that the General Product Safety Directive did not address online marketplaces at all. So there was more or less a blank issue. It applied to all EU member states and at least currently it is retained EU law in the United Kingdom as well. So over to you, Katie.
So what is the new newly proposed EU regulation? Well, it is, broadly speaking, going to retain the overall approach that the existing directive does, which is the general obligation on manufacturers and importers to only place on the market those products that are safe. And given the wide range of goods that it does cover, because it does cover consumer goods, it's not going to set product-specific safety requirements, as you see with those mandatory requirements and harmonised standards and others in particular sector-specific legislation. But it will, continue as it does now to develop particular technical safety standards, as we've seen with the directive, and specific ones for clothing, for example, and other, sort of gym equipment and other type of equipment. And it remains the same position that if a product complies with a harmonised standard and manufacturer can show that the technical specifications are met, then you can still benefit from the statutory presumption of conformity. That will still remain, and we will see that continue in the regulation. A point to note is that unlike the directive, it is being proposed that this will take the form of a regulation, and as such, it will be directly applicable in all member states by mid-2024. Philip may be better placed to discuss this, but just the very short point really is that means that there will be a lot less scope for national variation, and the idea is to obviously have a harmonised approach across member states. And in addition to obviously trying to keep that continuity, that overall approach, though, as we said, there are some quite significant changes being proposed, and most of these reflect technological developments because, again, this was agreed, back in 2001 and wasn't really designed to deal with all the developments that we've had in technology. So there's a particular focus on responsibility for safety in the case of direct-to-consumer sales from outside of the EU, and Philip will talk about that in a moment with online marketplaces. There's a focus on the safety risks posed by software and products involving AI and the sort of overlap with cyber threats. And then there's expanding concepts of what safety should actually mean when you are assessing safety. So just looking at that in a bit more detail, there is going to be a new definition of risk. We have the same definition of serious risk that remains largely the same as under the directive, but there is then a lower level of risk that needs to be considered when you're conducting risk assessments, and that's defined as the combination of the probability of an occurrence of a hazard causing harm and the degree of severity of that harm. And the GPSR, the regulation, is going a little bit further to clarify whether a risk is serious. Not only must you take into account the normal and foreseeable use of the product, but you also need to take account of certain other specific and explicit matters that affect the safety of the product. These are now going to include environmental risks, and that also covers any effects on consumer health and safety. And that's of real interest because the proposal has highlighted in particular health risks posed by digital products and impacts on vulnerable consumers, particularly children, and that's we think designed to cover particular aspects of consumer products, where you do have that appeal to children and the interconnected device potential and the potential for connected products. So that is a real change. And then on the sort of technology side, the regulations are now expressly going to apply to interconnected products, and manufacturers and those in the supply chain, when considering safety, will have to specifically look at the effect of the interconnected products on each other, the presentation of the product, the labeling and warnings and instructions, and whether there needs to be any changes there. The cybersecurity features, what particular safety aspects are impacted as a result of that technology, and the evolving learning and predictive functionalities of a product, so really AI systems. So the manufacturers now will, when they're in this space and they are developing any sort of tech consumer product, will need to carry out their risk assessment with these impacts in mind. It is all very new, and to a large extent, I think we would say that the regulation is really looking for the future proofing, because the use of IoTs and connected devices in consumer products is becoming more popular, but the extent to which there have been any safety issues or indeed any case law around those sort of liability issues that arise is still very new. It's difficult to understand at this stage the true scale of what the sort of examples might be of unsafe products in that space. So really, it's now the Commission taking the opportunity to be ready for what is going to come in the future. There is also interesting changes in relation to, sorry, that slide there just set out some of the points that I covered then. There is a specific change in relation to a requirement to have an EU responsible person. This is a new requirement, and so there has to be an economic operator established in the EU. At the moment, this is only really set out in sector-specific legislation. They will need to appoint somebody who's going to be essentially responsible for the technical documentation, which I'll come on to discuss in a minute, but really just the safety of the product and being able to answer any questions or inquiries from the regulators, deal with consumers who might escalate issues and handle any recalls. And so the product's packaging and accompanying documentation will need to state the name of that economic operator and also postal and electronic address. And a really interesting change proposed in the regulation is a new requirement for these consumer products to hold a technical file. And that really is similar to the current regime for CE marked products and UK CA marked products now in the UK post-Brexit, and does add an additional burden for manufacturers. So what is now going to be required is that the manufacturer will have to draw up a technical file despite these consumer goods not being under the CE and UK CA marking regime. and carry out a risk analysis, based on the sort of safety features and safety factors that might impact the product. And obviously, this is going to be bespoke to the specific product in mind. A general description of the product and its essential properties that are relevant for assessing the safety, an analysis of the risks that might occur, and the steps that are being taken to mitigate those risks, any European standards or other industry standards or codes that are relevant to establishing the product safety and meeting the general requirement under Article 5 to only place safe products on the market. And that needs to be kept for 10 years, which is the same as you see in the sector-specific legislation, and has to be made available to market surveillance authorities upon request. There's also a change to account for modifications to products. So there's a new requirement on substantial modifications. So the responsibility for the safety of the product will lie with the person making that modification. And that person will then have the same obligations really as the manufacturer. And a change will be considered substantial if it has an impact on the safety of the product. And we see this is quite interesting because this is where we think software developers might be caught if you've got software updates that might substantially change the original product and impact its safety. That's an area where we see modifications might come into play.
Yes, and one of the key changes to the General Product Safety Regulation now is the introduction of product safety responsibilities for online marketplaces. As I just mentioned in the beginning, online marketplaces were not covered at all by the directive so far, and that is being now introduced. So an online marketplace or a provider of an online marketplace in the meaning of the regulation is an intermediary service using an online interface which allows consumers to conclude distance contracts with traders for the sale of products. So it's not about the sale of products in the own name and for the own account of an internet service, but allowing third-party sellers to arrange for sales with consumers on such an online marketplace. For these online marketplaces, or for anyone providing such an online marketplace functionality, there are certain new provisions being introduced. First of all, and perhaps one of the most structural changes is that there needs to be a single point of contact being designated who is actually in charge of product safety, which will mean that obviously there needs to be a person appointed, but that person needs to have resources, that needs to have compliance guidelines, etc., etc. In particular, and the next bullet is quite important as well, the online marketplace has to know the traders that are on their platform and which offers products, who offer products, which can be difficult in particular when we think about traders from third countries who may be difficult to identify because simply filling in a blank form and stating some name without any possibility to have background checks or some form of checks may not be sufficient. But obviously that is all at the moment quite unclear because we are still very early in the legislative phase. As well, which is quite important, there needs to be some reasonable efforts to check for dangerous products, which indeed means that it's probably similar to what market surveillance authorities do. They purchase products and do tests on these products. Obviously, that depends on a risk assessment, what kind of products are more dangerous than others. And some of these more dangerous products probably will need to be checked physically. Some others may be checked like on the basis of documentation provided by traders, etc. But as well, and again, there needs to be some procedure in place to deal with safety checks for dangerous products. And with all these duties in the background, there will be the possibility for market surveillance authorities to actually address online marketplaces directly issue orders towards online marketplaces that can demand that certain products are removed from platforms, to disable access to them, and to actually issue explicit warnings. What is as well important is that there's a very short time frame upon which online marketplaces have to react to market surveillance authorities orders, which is at most 2 days, and in particular, well, and even these 2 days may be in single circumstances too long when it comes to very, very dangerous situations. But again, that needs to be complied with on a policy level, on a compliance policy level as well. What we see also, and now being introduced, is a separate obligation of online marketplaces to notify authorities as well if they become aware of serious risk or actual damages to health caused by products sold on their marketplace. So that's quite a series of obligations that online marketplaces have to address, and which will require them to introduce new policies and new guidelines, and probably to designate some people to deal more intensely with product safety requirements. A separate issue which the General Product Safety Regulation now places much more emphasis on is to deal with recalls and other remedies. First of all, the recalls will be reported by the safety gate. The safety gate is not much else than what's been known as RAPEX in so far. I mean, it's already been known as a safety gate, but the legislation already, still spoke about the RAPEX functionality, and that's simply been replaced by safety gate to come to a coherent designation of this term. What is important is that we have, for every manufacturer or responsible person, and duty to report an accident caused by a product which has resulted in an individual's death or serious adverse effects on their health, safety, permanent or temporary, including injuries or other damages to the body. So that means not only that there is a duty to report that, but there is a corresponding duty to actually have some monitoring functionality for any manufacturer or responsible person who is monitoring the safety of the products, who has some functionality or some possibility for consumers or distributors or other market participants to inform the manufacturer about such events, and then the manufacturer has to act and make an immediate notification via the safety gate. There is now as well, which is interesting, quite in Article 35, clear language being prescribed on how to draft word a product recall. For example, as we've stated here, wordings like voluntary, precautionary, rare specific situations, etc., which you will often read in product recalls, which are not ordered by authorities, have to be avoided, to be considered sufficient recalls under the new GPSR, which is to some extent interesting because you will need recalls as well to comply on a product liability side with your duty to avoid any further damage claims by consumers being heard at a later stage by such products. So there is a certain inherent conflict between the product liability recall and the relatively detailed prescription of what you have to state under these product safety rules. What is very interesting as well is that the new product safety regulation actually prescribes what you have to do to make an efficient recall. and which means says as well that you have to offer at least two of the following three options, which are either to repair the product, replace the product, or refund the product. That is, at least from a German perspective, probably what is in most circumstances required for an effective recall of a consumer product as well, not so much for a business product, but the regulation is dealing with consumer products only. But we haven't seen that so far on a product safety legislative background. So that is an interesting provision as well. So we can say there is a strong emphasis on strengthening recall and product safety warning mechanisms. What there is as well is, and where this fits well into many other developments we see on a European Union level, is a strengthening of class actions, of so-called class actions, class action lights, if you want to say so, which under the EU level follow the name of representative actions. And the GPSR amends the EU representative actions directive in such a sense that member states will have to allow representative actions for damages caused by an unsafe product, which makes sense because that is one of the core European Union legislative instruments for which a representative action may actually be something a suitable form of action. So there will be the possibility that in future consumers, depending on the relevant jurisdiction, form a kind of class to bring suit against manufacturers for damages caused by their unsafe products. So we may as well see certain damage claims simply being brought after every recall. That's probably remains to be seen whether that happens like it is now in the US, but there is a certain threat that that may be the case. Penalties on the public law side for the infringements of the GPSR are not dealt with in detail by the draft regulation, but will be left to the discretion of the member states. But they must be, as said here, effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So that is something we'll be seeing once these provisions are being implemented. So,
thanks, Philip. So I'm going to come on to say that we're quite behind the European Commission on all of this. Although before I do, I would like to say that on the recall notices, the OPSS in the UK published a template recall notice and a code of practice for consumer product safety back in 2018, the PAS 7100. So that has been in place, and businesses in the UK have been strongly encouraged to use that as guidance and follow those precedent and template documents when carrying out a recall. So I'd like to think that the European Commission took a little bit from the UK there. But just separate from that, because of Brexit, the new regulation will not be automatically implemented into the UK, but it is highly relevant for those goods that are placed on the EU market by UK businesses. And we are expecting similar, or at least we are definitely going to see an overhaul of the UK product safety regime coming into force, although we don't have a huge amount of clarity on the timing of that yet. But in view of the withdrawal from the EU back in 2018, the OPSS was set up, and one of the first things it said it would do would be looking at an overhaul of the product safety regime. And they launched a call for evidence back in 2021, for which responses were received towards the end of 2021. And that hasn't really provided us with a huge amount of information as to what the OPSS will do. But we do know that they are sort of seeing this as a unique opportunity to update the framework. And so, we might read into that it might diverge in some ways from the EU proposal and this regulation that we're discussing today. But equally, they understand that, in order for the UK to maintain a global outlook and obviously enable those UK businesses to market the products in the EU and the UK, that they really do, need to probably align to many of the proposals that are being suggested here. But we are, as I said, still waiting to hear further from the OPSS on the proposals following the call for evidence. We would, I think, be surprised if the legislation that might be proposed by the UK is going to be substantially different. That will cause some complications to supply chains and unnecessary burdens that I know that really the UK government do not want. They don't want to sort of frustrate the supply chain in that way. But just very briefly, what did that sort of call for evidence cover in the UK? Well, really, it did focus on a lot of the issues that the new EU regulation has been looking at. In particular, the different types of products that we now see on the market, with a focus on new technologies and connected devices, and those sort of boundaries there between products and services. The new models of supply. So again, the OPSS in the UK are very much alive to the position of the online marketplace, and where that should and should not be regulated, and what additional obligations are needed there. Also, sort of new new products and product life cycles is really just the same point as one on the impact of technology on products, and the risks in relation to cyber, and what sort of software updates may or may not do to the safety of the product. Enforcement considerations were also looked at as well. What sort of changes might need to be made in relation to ensuring adequate and sufficient enforcement, and particularly how the UK OPSS regulator will connect and work together with the international counterparts. And then lastly, it was ensuring that there would be a diverse and inclusive product safety framework. They want to make it better for more vulnerable and underrepresented groups, to ensure that they get the full protection. So in a nutshell, the UK government does recognise the need for a long-term approach to modernise the current system, and there will be change in the product safety legislation in the UK, but we are not that far down the line in knowing what that will look like. We do see that there are some implementing measures or some voluntary action that can be taken now, particularly in relation to online marketplaces. And I know that most online marketplaces have really good relationships with the regulators. They have their primary authorities who they use to seek advice from, and work cooperatively with them, and are already very much doing as much as they can to ensure product safety, and that any unsafe products are removed from the market. But unfortunately, it's a bit of a wait and see insofar as the UK is concerned. But as I said, I still believe that the regulation is highly relevant to UK businesses, because of those that are placing goods on the EU market.
Yes, what should you do now? Perhaps one step back to timing. We think that the regulation is probably now in a form that is likely to be adopted, and there's a certain likelihood that that will be already in March, and we'll have then about 18 months until it applies. So we're looking at something in autumn of 2024. Which is some time ahead, but not terribly long ahead. Which in particular is a significant issue for those companies who have not been dealing with product safety issues. In particular, when we look at online marketplaces, there are certain requirements, but there's not only certain requirements for online marketplaces to deal with, but probably certain requirements they want to impose on their traders when it comes to identification, etc., etc. So I would say that we should be probably looking at starting to implement these requirements over the next couple of months already. As you see, updating risk assessments is probably one of the key factors, looking at the new risk definitions. And Katie, as you said, the technical files will be needed to be prepared. That typically requires some time. And probably have a look at labeling changes and warnings, etc.
Yeah, I think documentation is really a key takeaway, that there is going to be an added burden for those manufacturers and importers and distributors of consumer products, which wasn't there before. So I think the documentation burden is one that you will want to give yourself sufficient time to prepare for, and then also the authorised rep in the EU. I mean, in the UK in particular, we've been dealing with that quite significantly post Brexit to ensure that particular businesses of particular products do have a UK presence, and the authorised representative market has exploded a little bit here. But for the EU, that's something that will come in to place with the new regulation. So businesses might want to start making sure that they are well represented in the EU and the UK market.
Yeah, and setting up guidelines, policies as compliance policies for the monitoring, traceability, and recall systems is something which will need to be in place. Well, to some extent, they need to be in place already, but that needs to be updated, reviewed, and made fit for purposes under the new regulation as well. And as I said in the beginning, reviewing third-party trader agreements and audit rights is probably the most time-intensive issue for online marketplaces. I think that's pretty much it. What we wanted to cover. I've seen already one question being asked. I'll probably read it and leave it for you, Katie, to answer.
Okay. I can't see it, so yeah,
well,
sorry.
Okay. Given that the new GPSR will include a new definition of safety, also addressing several issues arising from new technologies, would you say that manufacturers will have more legal safety as they might use it as some sort of safe harbor if the products comply compared to the current situation, where laws are silent on a lot of issues? Or would you say that the GPSR is just broader and it poses a higher risk exposure for manufacturers?
That is interesting, because at the moment it is very unclear as to how the directive will apply and does apply to those products where you have technology playing a part, and connected devices. I think there's no question about it. One of the overall purposes of this regulation is to bring those sorts of products firmly into scope. So yes, I think it's certainly arguable that at the moment there are grey areas. Same applies to online marketplaces and their obligations, which are not set out currently in the directive. So it will, it will bring them firmly into scope. Whether it will give them a safe harbour, taking that to mean that they can have a fallback and say it's safe because we've considered X, Y, Z. Well, it doesn't give them that presumption of conformity. That only comes into play if you've got the standards that you can rely on. And of course, in setting up new standards for some of the tech is going to be quite a challenge. And then you might have to look at how it's going to interplay with the AI Act and the safety framework there, and what standards are going to be built in for actually bringing those AI products to market. So I don't think it will be a complete get out, no, but it will obviously assist in being able to establish that they've carried out an adequate risk assessment.
I think I agree with everything you said, but I would like to add that, I mean, looking at the general scope of developments in the products field in the European Union, I see a higher risk for manufacturers and other market participants in future to be held liable for failures to comply with product safety requirements, held liable in events of product liabilities, etc. So I think we'll see a trend towards more consumer complaints towards manufacturers over the next couple of years. I think that's probably a fair prediction.
Yeah, agreed.
I can't see any further questions. So given that, I guess we'll close for today. We'll share the presentation and I think even the recording of the session if this went well with everyone who registered, and would certainly welcome any feedback or any questions you may have afterwards.
Yeah, do drop us an email if you'd rather not put it in the chat. That's absolutely fine. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.